August 17th, 1944, northern France, near Fiel. The GMC CCKW sat abandoned on the roadside, its canvas cover torn by shrapnel, its engines still warm with the heat of battle. The convoy it had once been part of had been ambushed in a Luftwaffe strafing run, one of the increasingly rare moments when German aircraft dared to show themselves over France. The air still hung with the smell of burnt metal, the faint echo of the attack reverberating in the silence. As the dust settled, a group of German mechanics from the 276th Infantry Division cautiously approached the truck, their boots crunching over the broken ground, their expressions unreadable. They were here to assess, not just salvage, but to understand. "Get the Hopfeld Weibel," one of them called out. "This one's intact." What the mechanics discovered over the next hour would shake their confidence in everything they had assumed about American industry. The truck was massive compared to German vehicles. At 2.5 tons, it far outweighed the typical Opel Blitz. Yet it was not its size alone that caught their attention, but the meticulous design that spoke of an industrial philosophy no one had anticipated. The six-cylinder engine, though simple, was accessible with parts clearly labeled in English. The manual, printed on quality paper with detailed illustrations, was laid out in such a way that even someone with minimal training could follow. "Look at this," the Hopfeld Weibel said as he flipped through the manual, pausing at each page. "Everything is explained with pictures. A child could follow these instructions." They had captured American trucks before, but none as revealing as this. The GMC bore markings indicating it was a 1943 CCKW 353 model, a standard truck produced in Pontiac, Michigan. Thousands had been built that year alone. The numbers were staggering. A single factory, producing trucks at a rate Germany couldn't even dream of. But it wasn't just about quantity. It was about something deeper, something that hit harder than the explosion of a bomb. The mechanics dove deeper into the truck's anatomy. The engine, producing just 104 horsepower from 269 cubic inches, seemed unimpressive on paper. The Germans prided themselves on precision engineering, but what they found in the GMC was far from that. It wasn't perfection that mattered here, it was practicality. Every bolt was the same size, every nut interchangeable. The spark plugs were easy to access, and the oil filter could be replaced without tools. The Hopfeld Weibel's voice shook as he muttered to himself, "This is designed for idiots." But another mechanic corrected him. "No, it's designed for an army of millions, where most men aren't mechanics. This is brilliance." They had been looking at the truck all wrong. It wasn't meant for flawless engineering. It was meant for war, designed for America's conscripted army, filled with farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Pennsylvania, ready to drive with minimal training. The truck had been built with them in mind. The engine, the body, every component was designed for replacement and mass production, not finesse. The suspension, simple yet unbreakable, dwarfed the complex torsion bar system used by their own Opel trucks. The Opels had struggled through the muddy roads of France, and here was an American truck, able to power through terrain that would have trapped their own vehicles. "This is not perfection," one mechanic said with growing realization. "It's sheer ruggedness." The design wasn't about making a flawless machine. It was about creating something that could be easily fixed in the field, something capable of withstanding the brutality of war. The shock hit deeper when they examined the frame. The production number stamped into it revealed that this truck was just one of 150,000 built in 1943 alone. 1 year, one plant, Pontiac, producing this many trucks. A single plant, while Germany struggled with a fraction of that number, trying to maintain its factory standards. The numbers didn't add up. If one plant could produce so many, how many plants did the Americans have? The answer, though not spoken aloud, was clear. Dozens. Chevrolet, Studebaker, Dodge, Ford. All of them were churning out vehicles like this, and all of them had interchangeable parts. This was industrial warfare, and it was being waged on a scale never seen before. It was here, in this abandoned truck on the roadside, that the mechanics realized Germany had already lost the war, not on the battlefield, but in the factories of Detroit. Their Opel Blitz trucks, which were seen as the backbone of the Wehrmacht's logistical machine, were no match for the Americans' mass production. "How can they produce so many?" a German officer asked that evening as he joined the inspection. He had worked in the Opel plant in Brandenburg before the war, and his understanding of automotive manufacturing was second to none. "What we're looking at isn't just a truck, it's a manufacturing philosophy we can't compete with." The simplicity of the GMC, its crude yet efficient design, was something the Germans had never considered. Its body panels, stamped out of steel, could be produced by any factory press. The cargo bed was made of standard lumber. The canvas top was commercial-grade fabric. Nothing specialized, everything available in abundance. The Germans had built their vehicles with precision, but the Americans had built theirs for the demands of total war, assuming neglect, misuse, and catastrophic conditions. And that realization, like the sharp sting of cold metal, echoed in the minds of the German mechanics as they worked late into the night, studying the truck. By the time the unit received orders to withdraw eastward on August 25, 1944, they had seen something that would change their perception of war logistics forever. An American convoy passed, not a tactical movement, but a supply column, an endless stream of GMC CCKW trucks, all identical, all loaded with supplies. The Germans, stationed on a parallel road, watched in disbelief as one truck after another passed them, the column stretching into the distance until the horizon swallowed it whole. "Where are their horses?" one young soldier asked, his voice filled with confusion. The Hopfeld Weibel, who had never seen a fully motorized army before, realized what this question truly meant. In the Wehrmacht, 80% of logistics still relied on horses. These were animals that required care, food, water, rest. They could march perhaps 30 kilometers a day under good conditions, and when winter came, they perished by the thousands. The Americans, they had trucks, thousands of them. Trucks that could move hundreds of kilometers a day without needing food or rest. Trucks that didn't freeze to death in the snow. The supply officer, having spent countless hours in factories, made a terrifying calculation. "Each American division has approximately 2,000 trucks," he said, "and there are 40 divisions in France. That's 80,000 trucks. We have 3 million horses and maybe 100,000 trucks across all fronts. How do they do it?" The answer was almost too painful to speak aloud. They were doing it because they could. They had a capacity no one else could even dream of. As the convoy rolled past, the reality of the situation became impossible to deny. The Americans had already won, not with tactical brilliance on the battlefield, but with something much more fundamental: logistics. The Germans, struggling with dwindling resources and outdated methods, could no longer deny the truth. The war wasn't just being fought with tanks and planes, it was being fought with trucks, American trucks. And as that convoy passed, a hum of recognition seemed to ripple through the German ranks. Victory, it seemed, would come not from the tip of a tank's barrel, but from the wheels of a simple, sturdy, and relentless truck. It was at that moment, standing beside the road in the twilight of history, that the Germans finally understood. They had prepared for everything: tanks, planes, ships, but not for American trucks. The rest of the war for the Germans had been decided. It was August 1944, a period that had already seen the tides of war shift. The battlefields of France had witnessed the sound of tanks and artillery thunder across the plains, but it was the quiet, mechanical hum of something far less glamorous that was slowly sealing the fate of the Wehrmacht. The engines of American trucks, more specifically the GMC CCKW, rumbled steadily, day and night, carrying crucial supplies across the land. These weren't the tanks and planes that the Germans had expected to face, but the sheer mechanical efficiency of thousands of these trucks that could roll on endlessly. As German forces attempted to regroup after the heavy losses suffered during the Normandy invasion, they couldn't escape the hum of those American trucks that cut through the French countryside like a knife through butter. While the Wehrmacht clung to its reliance on horsepower, literally and figuratively, the Americans, a nation driven by mass production and logistical ingenuity, had already sealed their victory before the first shot was fired. They had already won, not with bullets, but with the relentless grind of industrial might. The German engineers, mechanics, and officers, who had long prided themselves on their precision and attention to detail, now found themselves confounded by the simplicity of American engineering. The CCKW was nothing fancy, just a utilitarian machine built for one purpose: to keep moving, no matter the obstacles in its path. Whereas the Germans had perfected the craft of creating machines that ran like fine-tuned instruments, the Americans had embraced the philosophy of design that prioritized quantity, durability, and, most crucially, simplicity. It was here, on the edge of what remained of their positions, that the full weight of the American advantage began to sink in for the Germans. Their beloved Opel Blitz, once seen as the backbone of the Wehrmacht's logistics, now seemed woefully inadequate in the face of a system that could produce an army of trucks almost overnight. Each of these American trucks was the embodiment of industrial revolution, a force more potent than any tank or gun. The Americans had anticipated every shortcoming, every failure of their vehicles in war. They had designed their machines to withstand neglect, abuse, and brutal conditions. They had engineered their vehicles with mechanics in mind, men who may not have been well trained in the art of fine engineering, but could keep the wheels turning even in the most dire of circumstances. By contrast, the Germans had designed their machines for precision, expecting maintenance to be done under ideal conditions, conditions that never materialized on the battlefield. As September 1944 approached, the unit captured 3 more GMC trucks and a Dodge WC-63. The Germans quickly realized that the parts from one vehicle weren't just interchangeable within the same brand. They could be swapped between different manufacturers. The simplicity of American design was astonishing. Where the Germans had dozens of different vehicles, each with incompatible parts and specialized tools, the Americans had one system, interchangeable, standardized, and robust. Tires, carburetors, electrical components, all of them were the same across their fleet of trucks, and more impressively, they could be serviced by any mechanic, anywhere, in any conditions. This meant that their logistical network was not only vast, but also shockingly adaptable. The Germans, who had relied on a complicated network of vehicles from numerous manufacturers, were now confronted with the fact that they simply couldn't keep pace. Their vehicles, whether from Opel, Mercedes, or BMW, all had unique parts that made maintenance a logistical nightmare. Worse still, the vehicles often required specialized mechanics, people who were scarce on the battlefield. In comparison, the Americans had built a system that could keep moving regardless of whether the mechanic was a veteran or a newly conscripted farm boy. As the German army's fuel supply dwindled, their vehicles began to break down at alarming rates. The few remaining Opel trucks, which had once been the pride of the Wehrmacht's logistics, were no match for the American trucks that continued to churn out supplies. It was on October 3, 1944, that the division's remaining vehicles came to a standstill. The horses, which could forage for food, had no such limitation, but the trucks sat immobile because the fuel had not arrived. The irony was undeniable. While the Germans had relied on horses and a patchwork fleet of vehicles to carry out their operations, the Americans had already moved on to a different way of war, one in which logistics itself had become the deciding factor. The captured GMC trucks, however, were still running, ready to move. These trucks, once dismissed as ordinary, now became a symbol of the growing American dominance in logistical warfare. The Germans, stranded in their own supply problems, couldn't help but watch as these American trucks effortlessly powered through the terrain, delivering fuel to forward units with almost mechanical precision. Meanwhile, their own supply lines were falling apart. It was during this moment of realization that the full weight of the Germans' failure to adapt to the American model began to sink in. The mechanics of the 276th Infantry Division, watching the trucks roll past them, were struck by a moment of clarity. "We designed our vehicles to be good," one of them said, "but they designed theirs to be good enough for total war, and in overwhelming numbers. That wins." This was the key difference that had eluded them all along. The American design philosophy wasn't about perfection. It was about making a vehicle that could endure war, one that didn't require constant attention, but could still keep moving forward, carrying supplies, fuel, and ammunition when it mattered most. The German engineers had designed their machines to be sleek, efficient, and precise, but in the face of industrial-scale warfare, such ideals were irrelevant. What mattered now was mass production. What mattered was the ability to replace and repair parts in the field, not just under perfect conditions in a factory. By the time the Red Ball Express had reached its peak in 1944, it had become a lifeline for the advancing American forces. The trucks moved, unimpeded, delivering more supplies than the German forces could ever hope to capture. The numbers were staggering. Each convoy contained thousands of trucks, all rolling through the countryside, all carrying the weight of an industrial powerhouse that the Germans simply could not match. The trucks were not just vehicles, they were symbols of the unstoppable force of American production. The captured mechanics who had spent days studying these American trucks were stunned. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a logistical marvel that seemed almost magical in its simplicity. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply line, it was a weapon. And as the war raged on, the Germans would come to learn the harsh truth. They were not fighting a mere army, but an industrial juggernaut that had reshaped the way war would be fought in the modern age. As November 1944 arrived and the Red Ball Express continued its relentless march, the German forces faced a new enemy, one they had never fully understood until it was too late: American industry and the trucks that brought it to life. The war was being won not on the battlefield, but in the factories of Detroit, where the true weapon of victory was being forged, one truck at a time. The engineers and soldiers of the Wehrmacht had underestimated American industrial capacity, and in doing so, had sealed their fate. The trucks that carried supplies, that kept the American war machine moving forward, would become the silent victors of the war, the machines that never stopped, that always delivered, no matter the odds. And in the end, it was these trucks, simple yet unyielding, that played a pivotal role in the defeat of the Wehrmacht. The lessons were clear, but they came too late. As the war continued to rage, the German soldiers who had once laughed at the thought of American logistics were now beginning to understand that the true power of war lay not in superior tactics or weapons, but in the ability to supply and sustain an army. And for the Germans, that was a lesson they could never learn in time. And so, as the trucks rolled on, carrying their precious cargo, the fate of the Wehrmacht was sealed. They had lost, not because they lacked courage, but because they could not keep up with the relentless march of American industry. The American trucks, with their simple, robust design, had already won the war before the first shot was even fired. The American automotive industry had long been built for mass production, long before the war even began. In the bustling factories of Detroit, Ford's assembly line and GM's streamlined production systems had been the blueprint for an industrial revolution. When war came, the United States did not need to reinvent the wheel. They simply converted their civilian production to military needs. The same factories that had built Chevrolet sedans now turned out GMC trucks. The same workers who had assembled Oldsmobiles were now tasked with assembling military vehicles. The transition was seamless because the manufacturing philosophy remained unchanged: standardization, interchangeability, mass production. These principles were the backbone of America's wartime strategy. Germany, on the other hand, had excellent engineers, but lacked the infrastructure to match the scale of American production. The Opel plant in Brandenburg, even at its peak production, could not match the output of a single American automotive complex. And the United States had not just one such complex, they had dozens. By September 1944, after capturing several GMC trucks and a Dodge WC-63, the German mechanics were shocked to find something remarkable. They realized that parts from one truck were interchangeable with another, not just within the same brand, but across different manufacturers. A GMC carburetor fit perfectly on the Dodge. Electrical components were standardized. Even the tires were the same size. The sheer brilliance of this system stunned the German mechanics. "They've standardized their entire fleet," the supply officer explained. "One set of specifications, multiple manufacturers. It means any mechanic can service any truck, and any parts depot can supply any vehicle. Their logistics are unified in a way ours have never been." In the Wehrmacht, each vehicle type had its own specialized components: Opels, Mercedes, BMWs, each requiring specific expertise and parts. If one broke down, a mechanic trained on the Opel might not even know how to fix a Mercedes. Parts warehouses had to stock components for every type of vehicle, a logistical nightmare. The Germans had thought their engineering superiority would carry them through the war, but now they were staring at the flaws in their own system. They relied on a patchwork of vehicles, each more sophisticated than the last, but none of which could be mass-produced efficiently enough to meet the demands of sustained combat. Meanwhile, the Americans had embraced a system that prioritized practicality over perfection. The trucks they designed weren't the most beautiful machines. They weren't the most advanced, but they were simple, durable, and designed to be repaired quickly in the field. They could be produced in staggering numbers. On October 3, 1944, the remaining German vehicles became immobilized after a failed fuel supply. Their horses could forage, but the trucks, reliant on a complex logistical system, sat idle. Meanwhile, the American supply chain, powered by thousands of GMC trucks, kept pushing forward. Fuel, ammunition, and supplies continued to flow, and the Germans, unable to match the American speed and capacity, watched helplessly. As the captured trucks were put to use, a German mechanic made an observation that would crystallize the lesson they had all been learning. "We designed our vehicles to be good," he said, "but they designed theirs to be good enough, and in overwhelming numbers that wins." The realization hit them hard. The Americans had built their vehicles not with the idea of creating masterpieces of engineering, but with a focus on mass production and field viability. They had designed for the worst conditions, the most abusive environments, and the least experienced drivers. The Germans had engineered their vehicles for precision, for functionality under ideal conditions. But in the chaos of war, where trucks were overloaded, driven through mud, and maintained with little care, precision meant little. The Americans had anticipated all of this and built their vehicles to endure. What they lacked in precision, they made up for with sheer reliability. The GMC trucks could take the abuse, and they did day after day, carrying supplies to the front lines while German vehicles were left stranded. As the Red Ball Express began its operations in August 1944, it was immediately clear to the German engineers that they were up against an industrial force they had no hope of matching. The convoys stretched as far as the eye could see, hundreds of GMC trucks, each one a small marvel of simplicity and ruggedness. The Americans were not concerned with individual excellence, but with quantity. The sheer number of trucks, all using interchangeable parts, meant that the American army had a logistical system that could not be overwhelmed. Meanwhile, the Germans, relying on their Opels, Mercedes, and other vehicles, found themselves at a severe disadvantage. These vehicles were excellent in their own right, but they couldn't be produced fast enough to keep pace with the demands of war. When an American convoy rolled by, it was clear. America wasn't just winning on the battlefield. They were winning with logistics, with the ability to transport the necessary supplies at the necessary speed. The stark contrast between the two systems became painfully clear. The Americans had millions of trucks at their disposal. The Germans, who had been relying on horses to move supplies, had only a few 100,000 trucks, none of which could match the GMC's durability. The answer was simple, yet crushing. The Americans had built their war machine to outlast theirs. As the war moved toward its final months, the impact of the American logistical superiority became undeniable. The Germans, unable to maintain their vehicles or supply lines, found themselves in a hopeless position. On the other hand, the American supply system, fueled by those simple, rugged GMC trucks, continued to roll forward, unstoppable. By the time the war was nearing its end in 1945, the captured GMC trucks were still running. They had endured the brutal conditions of the war and emerged as symbols of a new kind of warfare, one where mass production and standardization were the keys to victory. The Germans, who had once believed their engineering was unmatched, had been bested not by better machines, but by the overwhelming power of industrial capacity. German mechanics who had worked with these vehicles during the war, now back in Germany after the surrender, began to see the lasting impact of their defeat. The lesson was clear. American industrial philosophy had won the war. It wasn't the most sophisticated vehicles that triumphed, but those that could be built, maintained, and replaced in vast quantities. The GMC CCKW became a lasting symbol of the war's turning point, a testament to the power of mass production and the vision of a nation that understood modern warfare better than its enemies. The German mechanics, now civilians, would carry these lessons with them, helping to rebuild their own country in the years that followed. They would integrate the same principles of standardization, mass production, and reliability that had been the hallmark of American logistics into their own industry. As the world rebuilt itself after the war, it was the American system, simple, durable, and capable of sustaining large-scale operations, that would be the foundation for the future. The story of the GMC CCKW wasn't just the story of one truck. It was the story of an industrial revolution that reshaped the way wars were fought, and ultimately won. It was a story of innovation through necessity, of practical engineering that surpassed even the most finely tuned designs, and of a nation that understood what modern warfare required. And so, as the world rebuilt after the devastation of war, the lessons learned from the Red Ball Express, lessons about industrial capacity, about logistics, and about the power of mass production, would echo through the generations to come, shaping the future of warfare and industry for decades.